Geyer then located Albert Schiffling, who had a shop at 48 Virginia Avenue, Indianapolis, and he stated that on October the 3rd, Holmes, accompanied by little Howard, called on him and left some surgical instruments to be sharpened, but the child little realised that they were being sharpened for the purpose of dismembering his body so that it could be cremated in the stove afterward. A coroner's jury, after hearing the evidence, had no hesitancy in rendering a verdict to the effect that Howard Petizel was murdered by Holmes. On September the 1st, 1895, Detective Geyer returned to Philadelphia, and after being congratulated on all sides for unravelling one of the greatest mysteries in criminal history in America, he proceeded to bring the arch-fiend to justice. Holmes, having been indicted for the murder of Benjamin Petizel, the trial was set for October the 28th, while Detective Geyer was engaged in locating missing members of the Petizel family. The authorities in Chicago, Fort Worth, Texas, and numerous other cities were investigating Holmes's career previous to the death of Petizel. When the officials inspected Holmes' castle at 63rd and Wallace Streets in Chicago, they were astounded at the elaborate preparations made by this criminal to trap his victims and dispose of their remains right in the heart of a great city. This structure was a 4-storey brick building covering a lot about 50 by 120 feet. The lower floor was occupied by stores, a drugstore being on the corner, the outside rooms of the 3 upper stories having square bay windows, and were arranged into apartments and offices, with the exception of that part used by Holmes in connection with his human slaughterhouse. His rooms were on the 2nd floor, and in his office was a vault from which neither air nor sound could escape when the door was closed. From his bathroom, which had no windows and no means of lighting unless an artificial light was brought in, was a secret stairway leading to the basement, and in order to reach this stairway, the rug in the bathroom was raised and there was a trap door. The laboratory on the 3rd floor was connected with the cellar in a similar manner. There was no other means of reaching this particular part of the cellar except by these secret stairs. In this cellar was a large grate with a removable iron covering in front, and under this grate was a large firebox. In an ash pile in the corner, several small pieces of burned human bone were found, and in the centre of the room was a long dissecting table, upon which was found blood and indentures from surgical instruments. On July the 24th, 1895, Detectives Fitzpatrick and Norton of the Chicago Police began a systematic search for evidence of crime committed by Holmes in this building. They dug up the cellar, and buried in quicklime they found 17 ribs, 3 sections of vertebrae of the spinal column, and several teeth attached to the upper portion of a jawbone. A part of a child's cape coat, which was decayed and lime-eaten, and a woman's garment thoroughly saturated with blood and brown with age were also found. These discoveries were all taken to Dr. C.P. Stingfield, and after a microscopical examination he declared that the stains on the woman's garment were human blood, and that the bones were portions of the anatomy of children from 8 to 14 years of age. In one of his numerous statements, Holmes claimed that the Petizel children had gone to Europe in care of a Miss Minnie Williams. This resulted in an investigation as to the identity of Miss Williams, and also resulted in 2 more murders being charged to Holmes. Miss Williams entered Holmes's employ as a stenographer in 1893. At this time he was at the head of the so-called Campbell Yates Manufacturing Company, with offices in the castle. Learning that she and her sister Nettie owned a valuable piece of land in Fort Worth, Texas, he professed love to Miss Minnie, and it is said that they lived as man and wife in the castle. In the latter part of 1893, Minnie, at Holmes's request, wrote to Nettie that she was about to be married, and requested Nettie, who was a teacher in an academy at Fort Worth, to proceed to Chicago at once to attend the wedding. Nettie arrived in Chicago shortly afterward, but within a short time both girls mysteriously disappeared and were never seen again. In February 1894, Petizel, under the name of Lyman, proceeded to Fort Worth from Chicago and placed a deed on record from one Bond to Lyman for a valuable piece of ground at 2nd and Rusk Streets. The Bond was supposed to have obtained the title from Minnie Williams on this property. Lyman began erecting a building, and shortly afterward Holmes, alias Pratt, appeared on the scene. Their business affairs became badly muddled, and they left town before the building was completed, but not before Holmes stole a horse and engaged in numerous other shady transactions. On July the 19th, 1895, the police made another search of the castle and found more charred bones, several metal buttons, and part of a watch chain. C.E. Davis, who formerly conducted a jewellery store in the castle, identified the watch and chain as belonging to Minnie Williams, and also stated that he repaired it on 2 occasions. He furthermore stated that he'd seen Minnie Williams wearing a dress on which were buttons similar to those found. On August the 4th, Detective Fitzpatrick found Minnie Williams's trunk in janitor Pat Quinlan's room in the castle, a clumsy effort having been made to paint over her initials on the trunk. When confronted with this evidence, Holmes denied having killed the Williams girls, but he related a weird tale about Minnie attacking and killing her sister Nettie, and to protect Minnie, whom he claimed to love, he advised her to go to Europe, and he carried Nettie's body to the lake and sank it. In 1880, I.L. Connor, a jeweller, married a beautiful 18-year-old girl named Smythe in Davenport, Iowa. About 1 year afterward, a little daughter was born. This child was named Gertrude. In 1889, Connor moved with his family to Chicago, and he obtained employment in Holmes's drugstore, which was located in the castle. Mrs. Connor was still a beautiful woman, and being possessed of considerable business ability, Holmes consulted with her about several of his schemes, and they became quite confidential. Differences arose between Connor and his wife, with the result that he left, but Mrs. Connor and Gertrude remained at Holmes Castle. In 1892, both Mrs. Connor and Gertrude disappeared. While in prison in Philadelphia, Holmes was interrogated as to their fate, and he stated that Mrs. Connor died from an operation, but that he did not know what became of Gertrude. Who calls a baby Gertrude? Anyway, on August 2nd, 1895, some of Mrs. Connor's wearing apparel was found. Is that clothes? Oh, sorry. I'm overtired now. I think that's the problem. On August 2nd, 1895, some of Mrs. Connor's wearing apparel was found in the castle and identified by her husband. On this same day, janitor Pat Quinlan and his wife confessed they saw the dead body of Mrs. Connor in the castle. On July the 22nd, 1895, A. Minier, a nephew of Mrs. Connor, swore to a warrant charging Holmes with her murder. Her father, A. Smythe, produced a letter supposed to have been written by her in November 1892, wherein she stated that she contemplated going to St. Louis. Smythe stated that the writing was a poor imitation of his daughter's penmanship. In 1892, Holmes was president of the ABC Copying Company, which also had offices in the castle, and Miss Emily Sigrand was employed by him as a stenographer. She was formerly employed in a similar capacity at the hospital at Dwight III, where Petizel, under the name of Phelps, was being treated for a time. She was dismissed from this position, and Petizel recommended her to Holmes. She and Holmes became very intimate and were known as Mr. and Mrs. Gordon, where they had apartments near the corner of Ashland Avenue and West Madison Street. Miss Sigrand made a practice of writing several times a week to her parents, who resided in Oxford, Indiana, but after December the 6th, 1892, they never heard from her again. Holmes was suspected of having murdered several other persons with whom he had business dealings, and who suddenly disappeared, but as the evidence against him in these cases is by no means conclusive, no details are given. On July the 28th, Charles M. Chappell of 129th Street, Chicago, reported to Lieutenant Thomas of the Cottage Grove Station that he worked for Holmes as a handyman during the summer of 1892. On October the 1st, Holmes asked him if he could mount a skeleton. Chappell said he thought he could, and Holmes gave him the skeleton of a man to mount, and when the work was completed, Holmes paid him $36. In January 1893, Chappell was given another skeleton of a man to mount. When Holmes first showed him the body, it was in the laboratory, and there was considerable flesh on it. As Holmes had a set of surgical instruments and a tank filled with fluid for removing the flesh, and apparently made no attempt to conceal anything from him, Chappell thought he was doing the work for some medical college. In June 1893, Holmes gave Chappell another skeleton to mount, but as he never called for it, Chappell turned it over to the police on the day he made these disclosures. On October the 28th, 1895, the trial of Holmes for the murder of Benjamin Petizel began in Philadelphia. The work of selecting jurors had hardly begun when Holmes had a misunderstanding with his attorneys, and they temporarily withdrew from the case. Holmes personally conducted the examination during their absence. It was the theory of the prosecution that Holmes chloroformed Petizel while the latter was either asleep or intoxicated. 3 physicians testified that the death was caused by chloroform poisoning. Mrs. Petizel, who'd become a physical wreck, identified a photograph as the picture of her deceased husband, and also identified the clothing removed from the body in the potter's field as having belonged to Mr. Petizel. She then testified at length regarding the insurance swindle conspiracy and repeated the many conversations she'd had with Holmes regarding the whereabouts of her husband. To show that Petizel was not contemplating suicide as claimed by Holmes, Mrs. Petizel produced a letter written by her husband some days previous to his demise, in which he expressed his intention to have his family join him in Philadelphia at an early date. Several persons who knew Petizel as Perry when he kept the place at 1316 Callowhill Street identified the picture of Petizel as the photograph of Perry. Many of them saw the corpse and stated that the remains were those of the man they knew as Perry. Several of these witnesses also testified that Perry was last seen alive at 10:30 p.m. on Saturday, September the 1st, 1894, when he was visiting a neighbouring saloon to purchase a supply of whisky to last him over Sunday, the excise law preventing the sale of liquor on a Sunday. Eugene Smith, who placed the patent set saw with Perry, testified to finding the body on the following Tuesday, and experts testified that the condition of the body indicated that the man was dead at least 2 days. This would mean that he died on Sunday. Miss Yoke, who had believed she was Holmes's or Howard's legal wife, testified that she and Holmes were at this time living at 1905 North 11th Street, that on Saturday evening a man called to see Mr. Holmes, and that Holmes informed her that he was a prominent railroad man who was about to leave a large order for his patent copier, but that Holmes afterward admitted the man was Petizel. She also stated that Holmes left their apartments at 10:30 a.m. Sunday and did not return until 4:30 p.m., at which time his excited and overheated condition attracted her attention. They hurriedly packed their belongings and left that night for Indianapolis, remaining there but a few days and then proceeding to St. Louis, where Holmes called on Mrs. Petizel. It was proved that on August the 9th, 1894, Holmes telegraphed $157.50 to the Chicago office of the Fidelity Mutual Life Association to pay the half-yearly premium on Petizel's policy. No witnesses were called for the defence. In charging the jury, Judge Arnold, commenting on Holmes's absolute power over Petizel, said, "Truth is stranger than fiction, and if Mrs. Petizel's story is true, it's the most wonderful exhibition of the power of mind over mind I've ever seen, and stranger than any novel I've ever read." On November the 2nd, 1895, The case was submitted to the jury, and after deliberating a short time, a verdict of guilty was returned. On May the 7th, 1896, Holmes was hanged in Moyamensing Prison, Philadelphia. He assumed an air of utter indifference to the end. Some days before his death, when it was evident that all hope had vanished, Holmes made a confession wherein he admitted that he had killed 27 persons, but on the scaffold he contradicted this statement and claimed that the only persons for whose death he was either directly or indirectly responsible were 2 women upon whom he performed criminal operations.